Ms. Escobar is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your incredible leadership, your patriotism, and your service to our country. I am very grateful for it. I want to begin by saying that I am incredibly privileged to represent Fort Bliss. I represent El Paso, Texas, and Fort Bliss is offering hospitality right now to nearly 10,000 Afghan guests. And I want to say to those service members how proud I am of the work that they're doing to offer that hospitality. I had the privilege to tour the Doña Ana village last month with NORTHCOM Commander General Van Herk. Got to speak to many of those service members. Morale is high. And I could not be prouder of what they're doing. Had an opportunity also to speak to our Afghan guests as well and get a sense from them how they're doing. We know that the die was cast with the Doha Agreement, an agreement that former President Trump entered into with the Taliban and the Taliban alone. We have learned that it was that agreement that demoralized the Afghan army, and the Taliban moved in and began making deals with them which expedited their control. We know that that demoralization contributed to the rapid fall, the rapid fall of Afghanistan, which shocked us all. General Milley, earlier you told us that when former President Trump entered into the Doha Agreement, there was a setting out of very specific conditions that were to be met by the time of the May 1st drawdown. Is that correct?
That's correct.
General Milley, how many of those conditions had been met when former President Trump then announced he wanted to speed up the withdrawal from May 1st to January 15th, 2020?
There was only one condition that was met. That was the condition that asked that the Taliban committed to not striking against U.S. forces and our coalition forces, which they did not do.
And when then President Trump announced the expedited drawdown, was he aware that 4 of the 5 conditions had not been met?
I believe yes.
Do you know the significance, if there is any, of the January 15th expedited drawdown date?
I don't. I was handed a piece of paper and went over and talked to folks in the White House, and it was rescinded. I don't know why that particular date was picked.
Okay. Have we learned, or do we know whether those announcements of expedited withdrawal added to or exacerbated the demoralized nature of the Afghan army?
Well, the 11 November order was not announced, but the drawdown to 2,500 was. I mean, I don't know factually in the sense of we have detailed reporting, but I believe, and we'll do this in AERs, I think that was one of many contributing factors, not the only one, but one of many contributing factors to the declination of the morale of the Afghan security forces.
Thank you, General Milley. You've also described the outcome of this withdrawal as a strategic failure. Can you share with us what would have been considered success for the administration, the service members and military experts who've been involved in this conflict for over 2 decades, and what it would have taken for us to get to success?
I think, my opinion was, that success would have been a negotiated solution between the government of Afghanistan and the Taliban for a shared power-sharing arrangement in their government, and an end to the, civil war in that manner. I also assessed that the probability of that actually happening was low, but I did think that there was a possibility, and it wasn't zero. So a negotiated solution, I think, was probably the best way to describe a proper end to this war. I don't think that there was a military solution by us to defeat the Taliban. I think that was not in the cards. And I didn't think at the time that if we sustained a level of effort in Afghanistan with our military, 2,500 or 3,500 in those ranges, I didn't think the Taliban could defeat the Afghan security forces. That was my assessments at the time, and I thought success meant a negotiated settlement between the government and the Taliban and have a power-sharing arrangement to end the war.
Thank you, General Milley. I have about 15 seconds. Secretary Austin, has the U.S. military and Department of Defense begun to reimagine any of our existing involvements abroad to better assess risk of a fallout such as this one?
we continue to take a look at ourselves across the board and how we're.
And the gentlelady's time has expired, so that'll have to be taken for the record. Mr. Johnson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a dispute here today about the actual words that were shared in the ABC News George Stephanopoulos interview with the President. We took the liberty of getting the full transcript. I'm going to read you the relevant excerpt and ask you a question. And, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the transcript into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
So Stephanopoulos asked this, quote, "But your military advisors warned against withdrawing on this timeline. They wanted you to keep about 2,500 troops." Biden, "No, they didn't. It was split. That wasn't true. That wasn't true." Stephanopoulos, "They didn't tell you that they wanted troops to stay?" Biden, "No, not in terms of whether we were going to get out in a time frame all troops. They didn't argue against that." Stephanopoulos, "So no one told, your military advisors did not tell you, quote, 'No, we should just keep 2,500 troops. It's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that.'" Question. Biden, "No, no one said that to me that I can recall." So, gentlemen, with all due respect, the American people deserve to know the truth in all this. They're asking us to get the truth. So here's the thing. There's only three possibilities here. Either the President lied to the American people, or he legitimately cannot remember the counsel of his top military advisors in winding down the longest war in American history, or you have not been fully accurate under oath. General McKenzie, I'll ask you, which is it?
I'm going to be very direct. I cannot share advice I give the President, and I will not do that. I will also tell you, though, that it's been my consistent position throughout this hearing and the hearing yesterday that I believe the appropriate level of our forces in Afghanistan should have been 2,500.
I think we can take that to mean that you gave him that advice. Let me
Sir,
ask.
sir, I would not take it to mean anything other than the words.
Fair enough.
Please.
Secretary Austin, what is it? What are we to believe by seeing all this?
Well, first of all, you heard me say earlier, Congressman, that I support the President's decision. You also heard me say that I don't view this choice as a no-cost, no-risk choice. I do believe that if we left 2,500 people there for a long and extended period of time, you'd eventually have to reinforce those people because the Taliban was committed to attacking us.
Mr. Secretary, I understand all that. What we're trying to get to is, what did the President know? Did he forget what was told to him, or is he not being truthful?
I view that as an inappropriate question, and I won't.
Well, you may, but the American people don't. And the American people want and deserve accountability. And we even have service members like Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller being thrown in the brig for suggesting that. The public's faith in our institutions continues to erode precisely because everyone in the D.C. bubble appears to have some sort of immunity from the basic standards the rest of America is expected to live by. This is quite clearly one of the biggest military and foreign policy blunders since our withdrawal from Vietnam. So my question for all of you is very simple. Where does the blame lie? Mr. Austin, Secretary Austin.
Well, first of all, I am responsible for everything that happens that DOD does, and it does a lot. I remain focused on defending this country, and that's going to be my focus for the foreseeable future. Secondly, I would remind you that we just evacuated 124,000 people.
I appreciate that you think that was a big success, evacuation, but the blame for the disastrous withdrawal that everyone agrees was a disaster, who's to blame for that? I'll let the silence speak for itself. General Milley, you said earlier this month that it's possible that we would work with the Taliban to conduct strikes against ISIS-K in Afghanistan, presumably referencing our over-the-horizon capabilities. But today you testified, you said, quote, "The Taliban remains a terrorist organization with ties to al-Qaeda." So are you now suggesting that the United States form some sort of strategic partnership with a terrorist organization?
No, absolutely not. I'm not suggesting that at all. Could I go to your first question, though?
Please.
Like Frank McKenzie, like General McKenzie, it's not our purview to share specific discussions with the President in terms of national security decision-making. But it was our opinion at the time, and it's been very consistent. And I would also tell you that this administration did, and I was part of it, along with the Joint Chiefs, a very rigorous process. And this President was one of the most informed decisions that you can imagine in terms of all sides of the argument. We in the military, in the uniformed military, we look at the cost, the risk to force, the benefit, et cetera, in a narrow, focused view Other decision makers have a much wider angle.
I appreciate that, but what we're left with in the 9 seconds I have left is that we're supposed to believe that the president was either not informed by you of these very important factors, or he forgot it. Either one is alarming.
Gentleman's time is expired, and since the transcript was submitted for the record, we read through this kind of quick. But Mr. Stephanopoulos says your top military advisors warns against withdrawing in this timeline. They wanted you to keep about 2,500 troops. No, they didn't. It was split. That's what the president said. He didn't say, no, nobody advised me. It was split.
Mr. Chairman, read down 2 more lines.
I'll be done just a second, then I'll yield it back to you. And then Stephanopoulos says, no. No one said we should just keep 2,500 troops. It's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that. No. No one said that to me that I can recall. No one said it's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that. Those are the words on the transcript that was just submitted. I'll leave it to other people to interpret that, but those are the actual words. And yes, I will yield, Mr. Johnson, if you can do it quickly. Sorry, I want to get to some other people, but I should give you the chance. Go ahead.
I'll do it very quickly, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I mean, you just read it at face value. Stephanopoulos says, so no one told you, your military advisors did not tell you, no, we should just keep 2,500 troops. It's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that. Biden says, no. No one said that to me that I can
read
recall.
quickly through the it's been a stable situation part, but that's kind of the important part.
Okay. Well, look, it's open to individual interpretation.
I think we've both made our point.
All right. I
Move
think the
on
American people
to
would use common sense, and it's alarming, whatever it is. I yield back.
Ms. Lauria, you are recognized.
Well, thank you, and I would like to start, General Milley, by associating myself with the remarks that Ms. Cheney made at the beginning of her questions, and focus on the time frame immediately following the 2020 election. On November 9th, 2020, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper was replaced by Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller, and additionally, other key leadership positions at DoD were abruptly filled with new people. General Milley, did this rapid replacement of top senior officials at the Department of Defense in the final days of the administration give you concern regarding the transition of the administration?
We in the military are trained for leadership replacement from the time we were a second lieutenant, Fallout 1 drills sort of thing. And it is clearly in the prerogative of any president to replace any cabinet member or any appointee at all at any point in time. So that's how I would answer that. We're prepared to execute at a moment's notice if someone is relieved.
And General Milley, did you have any concerns at the time that involved the potential misuse of the military for political reasons?
I was determined to make sure that the U.S. military is properly employed, and I would render my advice to ensure that the U.S. military is employed not for political use.
Well, thank you. And it's been referenced a few times during the hearing today that you did cooperate with several authors for specific books. And it seems as though your choice to do that was that you wanted to get the story straight, the facts out there about different things that transpired during this time frame. And you acknowledged today that you frequently speak to reporters, and also yesterday in comments to senators that you sometimes do that anonymously. I think that we would all like full transparency and full understanding of the facts surrounding this time frame. And as you know, I'm a member of the Select Committee to investigate the events surrounding January 6th. So I can speak for the committee to say that we'll be very interested to have the same level of information and be able to speak to you in the future about those topics. And I'll shift now to another topic of discussion. And if I could ask my colleagues to please respect my time. So General Milley, you've spent half of your career fighting a war in Afghanistan, roughly. And when did you personally know that the war was lost?
Well, I think if you go back to 5, 6 years ago, I knew it was stalemated. Lost is a different word, but I believed it was stalemated, and I believed 5 or 6 years ago that it was unwinnable through U.S. military means for several reasons. There's a sanctuary in Pakistan that was not going to be destroyed or defeated, and that insurgencies are highly political wars to begin with. And what was important to win is to have an indigenous government that was seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people, along with a military, their police and army that could adequately deal with that situation. But I knew years ago that it was stalemated, said that repeatedly, internal and external, and that winning would be defined as a negotiated solution, as most insurgencies are historically. They result in a negotiated solution between the insurgent and the regime. And I thought that was the best way that this could handle. I didn't think there was a military solution.
So it's interesting to me that you used the word winning. Did you think that winning was possible, or did you think that a stalemate or a status quo was really the only ultimate outcome that we could hope for in this situation?
I think, as I recall, President Bush at the very beginning of this thing 20 years ago said winning would look a lot different in this war, or words to that effect. And I think he was right then, and I think that a negotiated solution was the best way of approaching a quote-unquote win. I think that would have been in the best interest of the United States, and it would have been in the best interest of the region and the Afghan people, was a negotiated solution between the Taliban, the insurgents, and the government.
Well, thank you. And I saw Secretary Austin nodding. I know there's very little time left. Did you want to add something briefly?
Yeah, you heard me say at the very top that my hope was that we could reach a negotiated settlement. A stalemate would actually provide the opportunity to do that for both sides to negotiate in earnest if neither thought that they were going to win. And again, we just never reached that point because the Taliban had advantages coming into this because we weren't striking them. We released prisoners.
Gentlelady's time has expired. I appreciate it. A couple quick announcements. So there is a vote on. We have a hard stop at 2. We're going to stop at 2. I am going to go vote. Ms. Loria, if you could take the chair for just a moment, I will come back as quickly as I can and then free you of that obligation. But it's my intention to roll through that. So members, vote accordingly, be here. I think we have Ms. Jacobs, who is up next on our side, so we have a couple of people to get us through that. But that's what we're going to do, and Ms. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll be right back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. Over the last few weeks, I have heard an outpouring of concern and frustration from my constituents, veterans and military families, chief among them, who have expressed their outrage at the disastrous withdrawal and the abandonment of our Afghan allies and even American citizens. I, too, am deeply outraged and have been equally stunned by the lack of leadership shown by President Biden throughout all of this. The American people deserve to have a full accounting of the president's decision-making processes and what ultimately led to the disastrous outcome. Gentlemen, this is not about whether or not we should have left or not. This is about how we left. We may not get all the answers, but the public deserves, in today's hearing, to know the facts surrounding this. My first question, two-part, regarding Bagram Air Base. During the Senate testimony yesterday, General Austin, you said the choice to abandon Bagram was made carefully based on the mission to protect the embassy. What aspect of security at HKIA made it more secure than Bagram? And following that, you mentioned in your opening statement Bagram had little strategic value. If you could elaborate on both of those, please.
I certainly didn't say Bagram has little strategic value. In my opening statement, we can certainly we can break it out and go through it line by line if you'd like. I would point out to you that I commanded Bagram at one point in time, so there may be other people in the room who have done that, but probably not. So I know a lot about Bagram and what it offers. The key point here is that the embassy was in Kabul, and our mission at transition was to provide security, additional security for the embassy. And in the event of an evacuation, we would have to start with evacuating the embassy first. And so Kabul makes it provides everything that you need to be able to do that. The capacity, the proximity, and so I think it was the right choice.
But isn't it accurate that HKIA has one runway, whereas Bagram had multiple runways, which would have made it easier for the evacuation of individuals from?
And that's a great point. I'd have to secure it. Now, the reason that we could stay there with 2,500 people earlier was because we had the Afghan security forces securing the outer perimeter of Bagram. If you no longer have that, then you have to commit 5,000 or 6,000 troops to do that, and then secure it, defend it, and then run the air ops. So that's a substantial additional commitment of resources.
General Milley or General McKenzie, anything that you'd like to add?
I'd just like to briefly talk about Bagram. It has 2 runways, but that's actually not what you want to examine when you want to look at an airfield. It's an arcane thing called a MOG. It's the ability to load aircraft and move aircraft around on the runway. And HKIA had better facilities than Bagram for that. Additionally, as the Secretary noted, the simple distance from where the people are had to be a planning factor. And last, of course, we were under direction to go to 0, 650 to secure the embassy. So Bagram was not an option under those circumstances.
Thank you.
I would add, if I could, if you have the assumption that there's no Afghan army, there's 73 towers at Bagram as a minimum. There's 3 big gates. You have to have a quick reaction force. You're going to have to patrol out to rocket range. And then you're going to have to secure this 30 miles of road between Kabul and Bagram. We would have never been able to get 124,000 people out of Bagram. It just wouldn't have happened. The center of gravity of a NEO was always going to be HKIA. The security issues clearly are different at HKIA than they are at Bagram. But Bagram was really not a feasible option, given numbers of troops, distance, and the security requirements.
Thank you, General Milley. Follow-up question. You mentioned, having to evacuate so quickly. Do you trust the information that you are receiving from our intelligence community? General Austin?
I have confidence in the information that we get from the intel community, yes. That doesn't say that they will be 100% right all the time, though.
Given the fact that it seems as though they did not at all plan for a complete surrender of the Afghan forces upon the withdrawal of U.S. troops.
They predicted that outcome, but a different timeline, as you've heard us say before. So.
In addition to the botched over-the-horizon activity that killed 10 Afghans, still believe that the intelligence community can be trusted and is effective?
Again, I have confidence in the intel community in terms of...
The gentlelady's time has expired. I will now recommend Ms. Jacobs, or recognize Ms. Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here. I'd like to follow up on the questions regarding the August 29th drone strike that killed Zamari Ahmadi, a worker for a Southern California-based aid group, and 9 of his family members, including 7 children. And General McKenzie, you called the strike a tragic mistake, and I think we can all agree with that characterization. This is an open hearing, so I'm not going to ask about the specific intelligence that led to the strike. But General Milley, you said even after the truth was revealed that there was a reasonable certainty that the target was valid. So I would like to know, do you have that same level of confidence in the intelligence that you have had for similar strikes carried out under DOD's authority?
Yes, I do. I mean, intelligence is not perfect. The intel, as Representative Johnson just said, or Vice just said, it's never perfect. We're not going to get perfection in the world of intelligence. They speak in terms of probabilistic language, what is more likely than not, and I believe that we have good reason to have confidence in our intelligence systems. They're not perfect, but we have good reason to have confidence in them. And I think that's been expressed over time in the accuracy and precision of these strikes.
I understand.
This one strike was bad. It was tragic. It was horrible.
Yes.
But that is not to say that the intelligence system as a whole is wrong.
Okay. But given that we've actually had multiple of these mistakes that we already know about, including the AC-130 gunship attack in 2015 that destroyed an MSF hospital and killed 42 civilians, what assurances can you give us and the American people that our drone program has adequate safeguards? And Secretary Austin, you said that the department has endeavored to learn from this latest mistake. What have you learned?
Thanks. Again, I would just remind you that I have directed a review of this operation, and so I won't make any comments on specifics here because that review is ongoing. But in terms of our commitment to learning from all of our operations, we remain committed to doing that. And we are specifically concerned whenever there is an inadvertent loss of life and injury to civilians. And so we take that very seriously, and we hold ourselves accountable for that. So.
Well, great. And we, in this committee, will be looking forward to seeing the results of that review and also having accountability. General McKenzie, yesterday when asked by Senator Mark Kelly about the over-the-horizon counterterrorism, you said, and I quote, "As we go forward and our ability to create the ecosystem that allows you to see on the ground and put it together is going to be harder in places like Afghanistan," end quote. I know many of my colleagues have already asked about what this means for our ability to counter groups like ISIS-K. I have a different question. What does that mean for our ability to prevent civilian casualties so that we don't see another drone strike like the one that took place in Kabul? And if the ability to prevent civilian casualties becomes harder, will you and CENTCOM take extra precautions in selecting target packages? Or how are you planning to deal with this extra uncertainty?
Representative, thank you for the question. The strike that was undertaken in Kabul on the 29th was a self-defense strike. It was taken because we believe there was an imminent attack developing against our forces at HKIA. So that's very different than the type of strike we would undertake in an over-the-horizon scenario. And the principal differences would be this. We would not be under the acute pressure of time because we thought the attack was imminent. Because if we're striking a target in Afghanistan, there's actually no imminency to that attack. You know, we're talking weeks and maybe months rather than hours or minutes. So you have opportunity to develop pattern of life. You have the opportunity to apply all the other disciplines of intelligence that can help us, whether that's signal, image, human intelligence, and we would work hard to try to reconstitute that to a degree, and I'll talk more about that in a future classified session with you. But it would be wrong to believe that the strike in Kabul, which I've acknowledged went badly wrong, is the prototype that we would employ for past or future over-the-horizon strikes.
Well, thank you. I will look forward to working with you all to make sure that we do that well, and I will note your comments on imminence next time we have questions about war powers with some of these strikes. But with that, I will yield back.
Thank you, and Mr. Jackson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Secretary Austin, General McKenzie, General Milley, for being here today. It's a very important hearing that we're having here. I appreciate the committee's urgency in making this happen. While there was bipartisan support for withdrawal from Afghanistan, there were differences in opinion on how that should have been conducted. Something we should all be able to agree on is that the withdrawal should have been conditions-based and there should not have been any political motivation involved in this decision, which I don't think was the actual case. But, General Milley, I'd like to ask you, how often were you in contact with your Chinese counterpart discussing our evacuation efforts in Afghanistan?
0.
Okay.
And I agree with you, conditions-based.
General Milley, on August 18th, you were quoted as saying, "The time frame of a rapid collapse was widely estimated and ranged from weeks to months, and even years following our departure. There was nothing that I or anyone else saw that indicated a collapse of this Army and this government in 11 days. Between the 18th and the 21st of June, in just 4 days, 21 districts in 9 provinces fell to the Taliban, and the Afghan security forces quickly surrendered and abandoned their post. This was an obvious beginning to the end of the Afghan army and to the Taliban takeover. General Milley, what were you doing during this time frame? Before you answer that question, let me tell you, you were just 2 days prior to when these provinces fell, you were here in our committee on June 23rd. You sat before this committee and you listed some of your concerns that we talked in depth about. One was defending critical race theory in the military, telling us you want to understand white rage, telling us how offended you were to be labeled as woke, and worrying about what caused American civilians to enter the Capitol on January 6th. I submit to you that perhaps we would not have had 13 service members and hundreds of Afghans killed, 18 service members wounded, and countless U.S. citizens abandoned and left as Taliban hostages if you had been more focused on your duty to this country instead of defending and pandering to the Biden administration's woke social experiment with the United States military, doing book interviews, and colluding with Chinese military officials. Yesterday, Senator Cotton asked you why you haven't resigned, and you said you were not going to resign just because the president didn't take your advice. Well, I submit to you, sir, that you should resign because of your dereliction of duty to this country and your inability to do your job and protect this country. It has become abundantly clear that the American people have completely lost confidence in your ability to do your job. General Milley, will you now resign?
I serve at the pleasure of the President, Mr. Jackson.
I yield back my time.
Thank you. And just for the record, on that date in question, what Chairman Milley was doing is he was appearing before this committee at our request and answering the questions that we asked him. And I appreciate his willingness and the willingness of all the leadership to appear before us. That is an incredibly important part of their job, and I don't want to leave any of you with the impression that we don't want you to do it, just because of questions like that. Mr. Cayley is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mahalo, Mr. Chairman. Aloha, Secretary Austin, Chairman Milley, General McKenzie. Mahalo for your testimony and taking the time to be here today. As someone who has also worn a uniform, still wears a uniform, I'm very appreciative of your service. And having first deployed to Operation Enduring Freedom in 2005, I am glad that U.S. involvement in the war is over. I support the President's decision. However, I'm concerned that the accelerated withdrawal, the strategic failure and fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban has damaged U.S. credibility with our allies and partners. As a former C-17 mission commander, I will never forget those images that I saw early in the morning of 15 August from Kabul, where total chaos at HKIA and Afghans falling out of the sky, desperate to flee the country. So I think my testimony, my question was focused on Secretary Austin's testimony, and it's really on the NEO operation that my colleagues, Rep. Crow and had referred to. And so, Secretary Austin, in your testimony, you stated that military planners had crafted a number of evacuation scenarios. In mid-May, you had ordered CENTCOM to make preparations for a potential NEO, and that on the 10th of August, there was another NEO tabletop. When did the State Department actually call for the NEO?
I believe it was on the 14th, Congressman.
Okay.
14th of August.
On the 14th of August, the State Department called for the NEO. So you stated in your testimony that the NEO remains among the most challenging military operations, even in the best of circumstances. And the circumstances in August were anything but ideal. Extreme heat, a landlocked country, no government, a highly dynamic situation on the ground, and an active, credible, and lethal terrorist threat. And that also in your testimony that you had offered input to the State Department that although mindful of their concerns that moving too soon would actually cause the very collapse of the Afghan government that we all wanted to avoid, but that moving too late would put our people and our operations at greater risk. And so what I'm trying to figure out is, you know, despite the President's decision to order the withdrawal on April 14th and that the troop presence will go to zero, on May 1st the withdrawal began. You know, by May and June of 2021, the Taliban had captured a quarter of the country. Representative Crow identified on June 11th, there was a NEO tabletop that was done. On August 6th, the Taliban captured the first capital. On August 10th, we did a tabletop. Why were we doing a tabletop on August 10th when the Taliban was rapidly advancing to Kabul? On August 14th, Jalalabad and Mazar Sharif fell, and by August 15th, the Taliban had entered Kabul. So that's what I'm trying to figure out, Secretary Austin, is why did we wait? I know we had to wait for the State Department to call for the NEO, but why did we wait so long to do that, even though we had pre-positioned forces, as you had mentioned, in Afghanistan? We had the 24th MU there, 82nd Airborne was coming in, but the airfield was still in total chaos on August 15th.
Yeah, so I think what changed the equation here, we anticipated that just based upon a disposition of forces that were kind of centered around the population centers, that the Afghans would, in fact, put up, you know, more significant resistance. And so we anticipated that that fighting would be a bit more intense. As they approached Ghazni, we didn't see the fight that we thought we'd see, and that was a trigger for us to begin to move some things very quickly. And then even as they moved north of Ghazni, we expected that as they approached Kabul, that again, those forces that were there would fight more. And there was a government in place still at the time. But with the government collapsing and leaving, And that precipitated the evaporation of the security forces, and that really panicked the people. And so what you saw on that first day was a result of that panic.
Should the NEO operation have commenced sooner than April 14th?
I certainly think it could have. Yeah, again, we had the elements to begin to operate a bit sooner. But again, that's a State Department call, and
Totally understand.
we provide our input, and it's based upon a lot of things. And this is not throwing my State Department colleagues under the bus. It's a very dynamic and challenging situation.
General McKenzie, you stated that primarily our NEO planning included AMSITs and embassy personnel. When did the NEO planning begin to include Afghans and civs?
Late in the spring, early in the summer.
All right,
We began to broaden that
Thank
plan.
you for your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Franklin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your patience and persistence these last 2 days. I understand, I know there's a lot of hours to be sitting before all of us, and when you're tailing Charlie, like I am in this batting order, most of the ground's been broken. But I do have a couple things. But first, I was kind of puzzled hearing General McKenzie's characterization of our departure now out of Afghanistan as being something other than a surrender. It doesn't feel that way to me. It certainly doesn't feel that way to the American public. And, 20 years ago, exactly, I was sitting in Bahrain. We were planning the initial strikes into Afghanistan. And at that time, our marching orders were to defeat al-Qaeda and to ensure that Afghanistan would no longer be a safe haven for terrorists. And now, fast forward 20 years, those conditions, while, General Milley, you said within maybe 6 to 36 months, the country will be ripe again, potentially to be launching strikes like that or targeting against us. It doesn't feel like it's anything other than a surrender. But General McKenzie, you had mentioned that holding Bagram was untenable under the circumstances and that the Bagram option went away when you were given an end strength of 650. I understand that. I assume that you mean that it was untenable because of the troop limitation. But if you had not been limited, would your professional military advice been to relinquish Bagram?
So at a troop level of 2,500, we would have held Bagram, and that would have been my recommendation. That was my position.
Okay. So you had also mentioned that there was no tactical reason to hold Bagram. Would you elaborate? I assume that would mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but strategically, would you see a value to us still being
So when I said there was no tactical reason to hold Bagram, I was specifically talking about the NEO operation.
Okay.
So once we went down to 650, and then we were given the orders to conduct a NEO. For the reasons the Secretary and the Chairman have already outlined, the center of gravity of that was actually HCI. It's where the people are. You got the MOG operating capacity there to move airplanes in and out. I will tell you this, though, Representative. We had a branch plan to seize Bagram Airfield should HCI have become untenable. But that would have required, as has already been noted, a significant investment in combat power. And Bagram and HCI never became untenable, so we did not have to consider that plan. Although we had a highly detailed plan to be able to do it, it simply was not necessary because we were able to maintain the throughput at HCI. And again, had we gone into Bagram, we would have introduced significant additional U.S. combat forces into the country and probably would have provoked another conflict with the Taliban, which would have been a political decision, not a military decision.
I understand, political decision. But here it is. Since 1898, we've maintained Guantanamo Bay. So we do have a history of keeping territory even in lands where we don't have friendly forces there at our side. But I do know, seeing already the challenge with over the horizon, conducting our strikes over the horizon, it sure would be nice to have that field now. Secretary Austin, I just want to wholeheartedly agree with Chairman Smith's comment earlier that we make the decisions in the world that we live in, and we don't have the luxury of having the magic wand. I get that, and that's the world you all face every day. You told us that you would like to have seen this conflict end with a negotiated settlement. General Milley, you did as well. I know there's been a lot of talk about whether President Trump should have been negotiating with the Taliban or not, and that's a different conversation for another day. But those terms that were agreed to were not really complied with by the Taliban. And here it is, we know that, General Milley, in your testimony, 7 of the 8 conditions that were given to the Taliban were broken. In light of that failure, Secretary Austin, do you think it was wise for us to continue with the timeline, or do we feel compelled? Because I constantly hear the administration pushing back, saying, oh, we had no choice. Our hands were tied. The Trump administration tied our hands to this timeline. But the Taliban didn't comply with their end of the deal, and now we're kind of stuck in a bad situation. Do you feel that we should have pushed a timeline, not necessarily to stay in Afghanistan? I get it. I think that there's a time for us to start negotiating an exit there, but in light of how disastrous the hasty withdrawal turned out to be, we could have used more time to get those folks out.
Well, quite frankly, because of the fact that, for a year we weren't striking the Taliban, they were increasing in combat power. We released 5,000 prisoners, which kind of regenerated combat power for them. They were able to make advances against the Afghan security forces because, we weren't doing things to fully support
And again, I apologize, the gentleman's time has expired. That'll have to suffice. Mr. Panetta is recognized.
Thank you. I appreciate this hearing, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, and thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your service, not just in Operation Enduring Freedom, but throughout your career's service to our great nation. As an American, as a veteran of OEF, I want to thank you for continuing to remind the American public not to reduce the service of 800,000 men and women who served in Afghanistan down to a 2-week chaotic withdrawal, not to reduce the sacrifice of the 2,461 men and women down to a single photo of a C-17 on the Kabul tarmac. But as you know, and as an American, and as a veteran, and as a representative, it is my duty to ask questions. And let me tell you, my constituents are asking a lot of questions. And I think the problem with the withdrawal is that it's left more questions than answers. With the withdrawal, we ended our involvement with the war in Afghanistan, but we still have the war on terror. We withdrew our troops, but will we have to go in? Yes, we evacuated 122,000, and you should be proud of that, but what about the others who remain? And on that note, I just want you to think about the definition of success shouldn't be based on how many people you got out, but how many people we left behind. And so what I'm hearing is a lot of frustration from my constituents who have family members there in Afghanistan who literally have nobody to turn to get out when it comes to on the ground. They're devastated by the deaths of the 12 Marines and the 1 sailor. And yes, I got to be frank, they're a little humiliated seeing the Taliban drive around, screw around with American equipment. And this is hyperbole, but I do think it sums it up pretty good, that I heard this quote about this frustration, and it says, something's not right when the Taliban can get American-made ammunition easier than Americans can. And 4, I do believe that we are dumbfounded that this government, the Afghan government, absolutely disappeared, and hundreds of thousands of well-equipped Afghan troops shed their uniforms, dropped their weapons, and ran. I do believe, though, that the underlying foundation for the reason for why this government crumbled and why those troops fled is corruption. We basically supported a Potemkin village, and when we left, it fell. And it basically set up a system, as we saw throughout the 20 years there, from birth certificates to death certificates. It was all about bribes. And what we were left with when we were about to leave was a state that had grown so corrupt that governors were cutting deals with jihadists to switch sides. Inflation was rampant because we were the money we handed out. And it left ghost soldiers, basically absentees listed on the payroll so commanders could steal the salaries. Very similar to what happened in Vietnam. And you're seeing a lot of similarities presented to that case. And there are a lot of studies, obviously, after Vietnam where it said corruption was a fundamental ill that was largely responsible for the ultimate collapse. So my question to you is, do you believe that corruption was the fundamental ill that was largely responsible for the collapse of the Afghan government? If so, elaborate. If not, what would you consider the fundamental ill for the quick collapse of that government?
Thank you. I certainly agree that corruption played a major role in the collapse of the government and the security forces. I also believe that weak leadership added to that, the fact that President Ghani frequently, without any apparent reason, changed out his commanders, which degraded the confidence of the troops in their leadership. So I think and then I believe also that the Doha Agreement had a significant negative effect on the morale of the military. And so I think there's a combination of a number of things that came together to create these effects. But I certainly agree that corruption was central to this issue.
General?
Absolutely, and I'd even take it one level higher. I think it's about the legitimacy of the government in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of its military. And I think that corruption is one of the contributing factors to delegitimize. It's my observation that, again, have to gather all the facts, but I think at the village level, the government of Afghanistan was looked at as parasitic as opposed to supportive, with the exception possibly of the Afghan army itself. But the government, the local officials, the police forces, et cetera, were clearly delegitimized in the eyes of the people, and that, I think, was a major contributing factor to the dissolution of the government and the army and the collapse of the whole thing in a very, very rapid period of time.
Thank you again. I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Okay, we've got quickly, we're going to do Mr. Fallon, then Mr. Horsford, and then we are going to be done. Mr. Fallon, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. During this hearing, the virtue of courage was used to describe the current president, and I think that's misplaced. I think the virtue of courage should be attributed to the 2,461 troops that we lost, that gave everything, the 20,698 that were maimed and injured and wounded, and the 800,000 that served. I'm a little perplexed, and thank you for being here. I wanted to clear something up. During the testimony, General McKenzie, you were asked when you knew that the drone strike on August 29th had gone tragically wrong, and correct me, just yes or no, you said about 5 or 6 hours later you learned that. Is that correct?
That's when we learned that civilians had been killed.
Okay, and so it went wrong.
No, I did not say that.
Okay.
I said that's when we learned that civilians had been killed. We still
Would you
didn't know
have
if we had hit
considered
the
that
target.
5 or 6 hours later a righteous strike?
We took that strike based on the belief that the vehicle was going to be used in an attack against us.
So we knew that people that should have been killed were killed 5 or 6 hours after, yes?
We knew that that probably people that were not involved
Okay.
in an attack.
All right,
were killed.
thank you.
Took us a little
Okay.
longer to
Thank you.
learn the
Thank
rest
you.
of the story.
Agreed. Secretary Austin, same. You learned about 5 or 6 hours after that people that should have been killed were killed.
Well, I learned from General McKenzie's reporting that there was collateral damage.
Okay,
And
thank you.
whenever that happens, we investigate.
Okay. And then General Milley, on September 1st, 3 days later, you described it as a righteous strike. People that were not supposed to be killed were killed, and you described it as a righteous strike.
Yeah, if you go back and look at the full quote, what I said was we followed the procedures. I had every reason to believe that that we followed our procedures at that point in time. We knew that there were civilians killed. We knew there were non-combatants, and there was collateral damage.
Yes, you said were others killed? Yes.
Yes.
Who were they? We don't know. We're trying to sort
That's
through all
exactly
that.
right.
But
That's
it's a
exactly what I
righteous
said,
strike.
and that's right. And
So
because I believed.
Kill people we shouldn't have, but it was a righteous strike.
I believe that the target that we were aiming
And
at.
sir, and I apologize.
believe the target
Thank
we
you.
were aiming
Thank
at was
Okay,
hit.
I have
That's
3 more minutes. Thank you. Now, General Milley, you served under both President Trump and Biden.
Correct.
Okay. I've spoken with former Secretary of State Pompeo, had a very extensive conversation with former National Director of Intelligence John Ratcliffe. And what was the general sentiment of senior advisors? If conditions weren't met, what would happen in Afghanistan? How long the Afghan army and government would last? You recall that? I would imagine you were sitting in on those meetings.
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. If conditions are not met.
The conditions aren't met and we withdraw, how long is the Afghan government going to last? Back then.
I'm not going to speak for them. I'll speak for myself.
Yeah, please do, because I know what they told me.
I'm on record having said that if we go to zero, that there's a high probability of the government and the Afghan army collapsing. In terms of time, I put that at between 1 and 3 years at the time I wrote this stuff back in a year ago in the fall of 2020.
So that's interesting that you say that, because when I talked to both Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Ratcliffe, they told me that there was unanimity. Even President Trump said if conditions are not met, that the Afghan army and government would collapse within weeks, and the longest they heard maybe a month or two is what they gave me. Because I was just surprised that, because Secretary Austin said in his remarks today that the fact that the Afghan army, we and our partners trained, simply melted away in many cases was a shock. John Ratcliffe told me he told his successor that they were going to collapse instantaneously if those conditions weren't met. They were going to evaporate. And now we're hearing that it was a surprise. What I think, General Milley, with all due respect, what I think it was not a failure of intelligence. It seems to me, I didn't know this stuff. I'm asking. I wasn't in the room. You were. That it was a failure to heed that intelligence and act accordingly.
I can show you the intelligence reports that were produced under Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you,
all
and
the
I
way
appreciate
through the
that.
current
I
time.
have 50 seconds left, so I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, so we got 5,000 bad guys in Bagram and jail at Bagram, right? Am I right, General McKenzie? And then we go down to 650. We can't hold it, so we split. But around July 1st, I think we left.
12th.
July 12th, and it fell August 15th, correct? And they got out then?
16th.
Right around
August 16th, and then we have an attack on our troops a couple weeks later. Can any of you guarantee the American people that of those 5,000 bad guy scumbags, none of them were directly responsible for killing our troops?
No, I
I cannot guarantee that, no.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Horsford is recommended.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, and to the generals. I'll be brief. I have several questions and appreciate your concise response. General McKenzie, on August 30th, you told the media that while you maintain the ability to bring American citizens and civilians out until immediately before the departure of the final flight, no civilians were on those aircraft, and that mission ended approximately 12 hours before the exit. So to clarify, when did the last American citizen successfully pass through Taliban perimeter into HKIA gate?
That's a very specific question. I'll have to come back to you on the record, but I will come back to you.
Thank you. And when did the last Afghan civilian successfully pass through the gate?
Same thing. It was some hours before, but I'll come back to you with an exact time on that.
And how many individuals successfully passed through the Taliban perimeter in the 72 hours preceding the departure of the final flight?
Probably in the low hundreds, but I'll come back to you with an exact number.
Thank you. I understand that on August 19th, ground commanders authorized the use of helicopters to rescue 169 Americans from the Barone Hotel after the initial plan for them to proceed on foot became too dangerous. At what time were rotary wing aviation assets no longer operation at HKIA?
So first of all, you're right. The Barron Hotel, we should note, is about 200 meters off the HKIA compound. So it's not a long distance, but we did use helicopters for that. We kept helicopters up until the very end. In fact, one of the final things we did before actually extracting from the C-17s was breaking down some helicopters and loading them.
And what were the specific contingency plans to continue the evacuation if the Taliban closed checkpoints surrounding the airport?
So at all times, we were prepared to accept American citizens that were able to make it to the gate. There was an external Taliban cordon. We've talked about that. The external Taliban cordon was actually part of the force protection scheme for the base. Commanders on the ground had to balance their force protection against the need to allow Americans, SIVs, and others to enter. So we tried to work closely when we could with the Taliban to ensure free passage for Americans.
So why then were the plans not implemented once it became clear that no additional American citizens were going to be allowed to pass through the Taliban checkpoints?
We attempted to, with the Taliban, to allow Americans to be able to get to the gate up until the very end. I do not have facts on why that did not happen. Our presence on the ground then, we should remember, it was very small, and we were beginning to turn inward as we prepared to extract.
Okay. General Milley, in 2017, the GAO released a report on recommendations to enhance the readiness of the Global Response Force to support contingency operations. In June of 2021, GAO assessed that the department had not implemented any of their 3 recommendations to improve readiness due to the ongoing development of the dynamic force employment concept. So I'm curious, what percentage of the total immediate response force and existing pre-positioned forces deployed in support of Operation Spartan Shield were deployed to HKIA to assist in the NEO? And how many additional battalions intended to be in IRF follow-on force were available for short notice deployment but not deployed?
We had, and Frank can correct me to 100% here in a minute, but we had 2 battalions, the MEU and another Marine battalion, pre-positioned in the Middle East, along with an Army infantry battalion pre-positioned in the Middle East, and there was a battalion already on the ground. So that's 4. Plus, we alerted on the Secretary's order, marshaled and deployed the IRF and the GRF, which is a brigade of the 82nd Airborne Division, very, very rapidly, and we had 6,000 troops at H-Kyer very, very rapidly. I think we far exceeded any of the standards that are published for the GRF or the IRF. In addition to that, we had a variety of high-end special operations forces that alerted, marshaled, and deployed extraordinarily rapidly. So we easily met any kind of rapid deployment standards, and we exceeded them.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to our military men and women and to our veterans who've served over the 20 years during this longest war in history, U.S. history. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today. And I know certainly it was a contentious hearing, but it is enormously important that we have the opportunity to have these conversations. I do not in any way support some of the comments that some of my colleagues made or the way they chose to conduct themselves, but that is a small price to pay for the transparency that we need to allow the committee to do its job. I appreciate you being willing to do that and giving us the opportunity to have this discussion, and we will certainly continue to discuss the situation in South Asia as we go forward. Appreciate your testimony. Mr. Rogers, anything for the good of the order?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the one thing I would like to ask is that as soon as practical, that we do have the classified hearing on the over-the-horizon capabilities, because as I've spoken individually with all 3 of these gentlemen, I'm very concerned about our counterterrorism capabilities and how we're going to address that.
We will have multiple classified hearings on that subject, because that's going to be an ongoing topic. But yes, it is something we need to do soon. Thank you. Again, we are adjourned.